The Chinese civilization is probably the longest lived of modern civilizations, second generally perhaps only to Egyptian and maybe Sumerian ones. It has existed since 2000 BCE. And if to judge by the statements of Chinese historians, which I do not advise you to do, then it is the longest lived at all, adding to its term of existence another 1000 years with all sorts of mystical emperors, semi-gods. And although during this huge period of time, Chinese culture and statehood were changing, the basic principles, pillars, thanks to which the Chinese Empire was created, and on which China can be said to stand to this day, were formed before the Common Era, just by the time of the creation of the empire. What are these pillars? How and when were they formed? My name is Jacob and I welcome you to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And now, through the history of ancient China, I will try to explain how and why China became China, and what China is, as well as try to repeat the history of its creation using the game Imperator Rome, with the mod Terra-Indomita, which expands the game map all the way to Japan. This video is unique for my channel, because usually the goal to which I direct the narrative is different from the historical one, but here they will coincide. However, it does not change the fact that the events themselves will be different from the real ones, although I tried to make them similar. And the video itself is a setup for all my future videos on China. So, how China was made. I would like to start this story in about the 11th century BCE. China, or rather what we now call China proper, the core of China, was a collection of different peoples and cultures, which can be divided into two groups, using the Yangtze River as a border. In the north lived Hausa, ancestors of modern Chinese, and in the south were non-Chinese tribes, Bayue. The closest to them now are Vietnamese. And as you could guess from the modern borders of China and Vietnam, the ancestors of the Chinese have historically been more successful. The most civilized of them was the Shang dynasty, the first Chinese state, the existence of which is actually confirmed. They occupied approximately this territory, although of course there were no clear borders. Their system of government was such that the one, their equivalent of the title of king, controlled only the capital district, and the rest was managed by his relatives, as well as authorized rulers of tribes and smaller principalities. So the farther away from their capital, the less influence they had over those territories. One such domain with little influence of the center was Zhou, located neatly to the northwest of the Shang's zone of influence. Being on the border with the Eurasian steppe, Zhou fought and traded with nomads, who were always a link between different civilizations and therefore adapted and spread their inventions and ideas. The main such invention at the time was the widespread use of chariots in warfare. These chariots helped Zhou to win the victory over Shang in battle at Mue somewhere in 1046 BCE. Well, probably not only chariots. Ancient Chinese historians also wrote that last rulers of Shang were evil and stupid tyrant hedonists, which overthrow wanted almost all people. But history is written by winners, so here it is doubtful. So, Zhou became the new rulers of this region, but having achieved such a result by force, they were doomed also to hold it by force. Because both people and elites usually do not like aliens. And Zhou as such were not Hausa, they had a different religion and culture. Therefore, Zhou needed a source of legitimacy. And it was found. The supreme god of Zhou was heaven, and they claimed that they defeated the Shen because their god helped them win. Simple and stupid. The religion of the Hausa was much more abstract, and there were no specific deities as such. They prayed to ancestral spirits who could influence the ordinary world from the afterlife. And since the Zhou were fewer in number, but numerous enough to have influence, their religion became integrated into the Shen religion. As a result, over a fairly short period of time, this god dissolved into the religion of Hausa and became an abstract concept of universal justice, which gives good, fair and just rulers can be said license to rule. That is, if you won the throne, you are a legitimate ruler, and if you lost the throne, you are not legitimate. This concept is called the Mandate of Heaven, and is the first pillar on which China stood and perhaps still stands. Now I will explain this concept in more detail, and tell you why I think that is very important. Look, who and under what conditions can seize power, especially in a system as large and isolated as China. For geographical reasons, China is the hegemon of the region, which means that it's only possible to seize power in China when the previous power is either weak or non-existent. And usually the people who come to power in such circumstances are outstanding in some way. They are either smart and visionary, or charismatic and brave. And if they can't seize power, they can't hold it. The retention of power in China is facilitated by improving the well-being of the people. Why the people and not the elites, you will understand yourself at the end of the explanation. Which means that the ruler will improve their welfare by building roads and irrigation facilities, reducing taxes and improving the control of crime and corruption. Also, the retention of power is facilitated by appointing your people to important government posts and local places. And with a good ruler, everything becomes good. Heaven as if helps a good ruler to rule well. However, this good ruler will die sooner or later and will be replaced by another one, and the chance that he will be good is not 100%. Suppose that several generations of rulers remain worthy, but then a foolish ruler appears, unable to control the composition and actions of his entourage, and then corruption increases and the efficiency of governments falls. His successor, regardless of his abilities, is likely to fall under the influence of the corrupt entourage and begin to lead a life of idleness, feasts, orgies, all these things, which from heaven's point of view is bad and only increases the degradation of the regime. Corruption and the increasing costs of maintaining the court causes taxes to rise and the spending to maintain the infrastructure and the army to fall. Because of this, discontent grows among the people, but it is tempered for the time being by the fact that the dynasty is still standing, and therefore legitimate in terms of the mandate of heaven. Then some extraordinary event occurs, a flood, drought or nomadic invasion, which the strong power would have dealt with without much trouble, but the weakened power could not handle, which is perceived as evidence of heaven's discontent with the ruling dynasty. And the outcome is divided into three options. Either there is a large-scale revolt of peasants, which demolishes the previous dynasty and a new dynasty becomes the head of China immediately or after some time. Or the old dynasty manages to suppress the uprising, under the influence of stress is renewed and continues to rule. Or power is seized by nomads, who are assimilated under the overwhelming influence of Chinese culture. This is how the Chinese dynastic circle closes. From what I have told you, we can draw three conclusions about the mandate of heaven. First, it explains natural, political and even climatic processes in simple language for the people. The ruler rules because it is right, and when it becomes wrong, the country becomes bad. Secondly, it gives the ruler a huge reserve of legitimacy. And in fact, as long as everything in the country is not terrible, the ruler is not threatened. And if it is a ruler who has just received a new mandate of heaven, he can do anything at all. Take Mao Zedong, with his great leap forward, his fight against sparrows and the Cultural Revolution, which killed tens of millions of people. All his idiotic decisions were forgiven and blamed on others, and he is still revered in China. Yes, the mandate of heaven is basically a pretty flexible thing, so it doesn't just apply to monarchy. However, the mandate has a significant problem for the country as a whole, and this is the third conclusion. Peasant discontent under such a system sooner or later reaches a critical point and erupts into huge uprisings, the success rate of which is much higher than the global one. And instead of correcting mistakes and fighting local uprisings, so to say to grease the gears of the state machine or repair it, the ruling dynasty washes its hands of it and gives the right to carry out reforms to a future dynasty, cementing the inevitability of its fall. That's the way it is. So far I have told you about the functioning of the mandate of heaven in the already established Chinese system. Under Zhou, however, this system was just beginning to form, so there are quite a lot of differences between their past and the general one, and I will tell you about them now. Having come to power, Zhou really started to do things I have mentioned. They appointed cronies and relatives from the side branches of the dynasty to rule locally, thus forming a reliable support for their power. which gave them the opportunity to expand the existing zone of influence, conquering the borderlands. However, such a system of governments worked efficiently only in the short term. Those who know the history of European or Japanese feudalism, and in China there was exactly feudalism at the time, will understand where everything was going. After a while, the territories owned directly by the Zhou were shrinking due to their use as a reward for the service of subordinates and relatives, and relations with regional principalities deteriorated, because over time gratitude for the lands given to them disappeared, and the lands themselves remained with them. But Zhou for several more centuries retained real power and enjoyed some authority. The turning point was 771. When the barbarians from the northwest, either Proto-Mongols or Proto-Tibetans, united with the rebellious principality of Shang and sacked the capital of Zhou. And since the Zhou for 2 centuries invested their funds in the capital district, which was the most logical decision, because it was the center of their power, then with the loss of the capital, they also lost the rest of their influence. Shan rebels gained the upper hand. The previous one was killed, and the nobles elected the grandson of Marquis of Shang as the new one. New Zhou moved their capital to the east, but from the former greatness remained only a shadow. The power they now had was only nominal. Zhou vassals to this news reacted in principle no way. They did not come to the aid of neither the Zhou nor the Shan, and therefore the result of the confrontation did not dispute. However, they realized that the Zhou themselves in their internal affairs too can no longer interfere. From this moment, in the history of China begins a period called Eastern Zhou, which lasted more than 5 centuries. More than 500 years of true Chinese battle royale, during which large principalities absorbed small ones, created alliances and fought among themselves. The Zhou themselves continued to be the jure rulers of China, because they were protected in the first place by the mandate of heaven. Remember, as long as everything is not terrible, everything is good. And in the second place by the existing political situation, in which anyone who would try to conquer the Zhou and become a new one was doomed to fight with all the other principalities, and it would not end well for them. At the same time, this situation greatly promoted the development of political systems, crafts, metallurgy and philosophy, because the fierce competition between the principalities forced them to take advantage of literally everything. Each principality tried to find its own way in building a strong state. The kingdom of Chu, the first who did not hesitate to take the title of one, proclaiming their independence, focused on traders, some focused on peasants, and some continued to focus on the aristocracy. By the way, the aristocracy in China, unlike the European or Japanese aristocracy, was not military, but rather scholarly. They certainly participated in wars, but not as elite fighters, rather as commanders. The reason is quite simple. The landless children of the aristocracy represented here a stratum of intelligentsia. They received a good education and were both civil servants, engineers and philosophers. And thanks to the fact that there were many principalities, every such scholarly man could find a job to his liking, or at least try. Thanks to these factors, Chinese philosophy had a golden age, which went down in history as the era of 100 schools of thought. And in fact, most of the Chinese concepts and philosophical ideas were invented during this time. The Art of War, a famous collection of obvious things, was written at the same time. 3 of these philosophical schools have had an overwhelming influence on Chinese society and statesmanship, but only 2 of them I consider pillars. However, there is still something to be placed on these pillars, so I will now tell you how China got out of the stalemate it was in. As I said, after conquering the Shang, the Zhou divided their possessions among the side branches of the dynasty. Actually, these branches in half of cases began to rule those major principalities that fought among themselves after the weakening of the Zhou. One of these principalities was Qin, a frontier state on the border with nomads, which used to be in the Zhou, which although was ranked among the 5 hegemons, but the strongest of them certainly was not. The constant struggle with the barbarians was quite exhausting, as you understand, and in terms of development, Qin lagged behind compared to the rest. However, this same struggle kept the army of Qin in a constant tone and made their organization flexible, because the nomads themselves were not a single force. General battles were not held, and therefore they were everywhere but in small units, and Qin troops opposing them had to become the same. It also influenced the composition of the army: archers, cavalry, pikemen, and light infantry. And everything was fine until their neighbor, the Duchy of Jin, with whom the Qin had good relations, did not break up during the dynastic crisis in the 5th century BCE. This process is considered the watershed between the relatively peaceful period of the Spring and Autumn and the Warring States era. The name speaks for itself. The three emerging states, Han, Zhou, and Wei, were aggressively opposed to the Qin and inflicted a significant defeat on them in the War of 413-409, taking from them the strategic outpost of Hanguan and Tongguan, which opened the way to the richest Qin region, the Guangzhou Valley. Faced with a threat to their existence, the then Qin rulers organized a large-scale talent contest, as I would call it, to see who could propose the best reforms to strengthen the state. The choice fell on the legalist Shang, who was given carte blanche for his reforms. But before I tell you what these reforms were and what their result was, and the result was impressive, I would first like to explain what legalism is, because it is the second pillar of China. The essence of legalism can be described by the following phrase:
The people are retarded.
Look, the highest good for man is the state. The state unites people, the state curbs nature, the state gives man a purpose. Man himself is insignificant, flawed, and only the state makes man greater than he is himself. And without the state, he turns into an animal. Therefore, the state should guide man through clear and simple laws that are not subject to discussion and have no double interpretation. Even praising laws is forbidden, because it is a manifestation of personal opinion. Only the ruler and his advisors should have an opinion. All but the ruler, the embodiment of the law, should be equal before it. And if everyone is equal before the law and the state, both the son of the sovereign and the last poor man, then a person should be judged only according to his merits before the state. Privileges should be taken away from the nobility, peasants should serve their duties only to the state, and the state would be governed by worthy officials, divided by ranks of nobility. The lands given to officials as a reward for their service were not inherited, which excluded the possibility of forming a new aristocracy. Punishments for breaking laws should be severe, so that no one dared to violate them. In fact, for anything more serious than theft was the death penalty. And in order to better control the observance of laws, whistleblowing should be encouraged. And to encourage people to whistleblow, the whole population should be divided into groups of 5 or 10 families, so that the person in this group was responsible for the crimes committed by the rest. The same was done in the army, which was conscripted. In general, the state put before itself and before its subjects two most important tasks: the procurement of grain and war. Grain is money and war is life, and therefore the efforts of people should be directed to those. The development of vacant land should be encouraged according to the principle: whoever cultivated the land becomes its owner, and therefore the concept of private property appeared in the Qin laws. To speed up the process, settlers should be attracted from other countries, giving them tax breaks. Thus, the Qin would get more grain, in their case millet, as well as conscripts for the army, reducing their numbers from competitors. All other things — education, trade, science, rituals, literature, music, arts, traditions — should be minimized. Otherwise, they will read books, go to their schools, and then discuss laws. But this is none of their business, these insects. The family is also a threat to the state, especially large clan families, which have survived since the times of tribal relations, because they can be relatively independent from the state, and therefore such clans should be double taxed. The emergence of private property also had a negative impact on the family and the nobility, because it made mandatory equal inheritance possible, which in turn prevented the concentration of land in one hand. The tax system also changed. Instead of paying a tenth of the harvest, the landowner had to pay a fixed tax, depending on the amount of cultivated land. And to calculate this tax were introduced unified for the whole state measures of weight and length. Thanks to this reform, the state received a constant income, and the burden of crop failures shifted to the shoulders of landowners. I think I've said it all. Shang Yan's ideas and reforms, as you have realized, were quite radical, and from the point of view of modern man, even idiotic. Literally 1984. But no one could deny their effectiveness. After their implementation, Qin turned into a super centralized, super efficient military machine, capable of recruiting hundreds of thousands of soldiers, at least according to Chinese historians, and also to equip them with high quality gear. Now that's an army with a state, not like your Prussia or Rome. The positive result of reforms was confirmed when in 316 Qin easily conquered two Bayue states, Shu and Ba. The area of Qin doubled, and received fertile and ore-rich lands of the Sichuan Valley, together with the settlers attracted there, gave a material base for further conquests. The opportunity to challenge a serious rival presented itself to the recently ascended to the throne ruler in 304, when thanks to skillful diplomacy Qin persuaded three other states, Qi, Han and Wei, to jointly attack Chu, which by absolute indication then was the strongest kingdom. But because of the strong corruption of local elites, in fact was not such. In practice, such was Qin itself, but in the rest of the countries it was greatly underestimated, considering it a semi-barbaric state. This war proved otherwise. While the Chu were fighting with the other kingdoms in the east, the Qin army quickly went to their capital, which was located in the distance from the rest of the kingdoms and was considered safe. And using the received after the capture of Sichuan access to the Yangtze River for transportation of provisions, took the city under siege, which was a complete surprise for the Chu. After a year of siege, the city surrendered and was subsequently sacked. The Chu were forced to move their capital to the new city, and the Qin, having captured several other key cities in the region, essentially gained complete control of it. Chu tried to turn the game by sending a relatively small army to capture the Qin capital, and they even almost succeeded, but the reinforcements that came up saved the day. At the same time, there was a decisive battle between the armies of Chu and Qin, in which Chu were completely defeated. And since in the wake of Shang Yan's reforms, the achievements of Qin soldiers were evaluated in the number of severed heads, their army was physically almost completely destroyed. After the occupation of lands south of the Yangtze in 301, Chu agreed to peace, with the recognition of the transition of all captured Qin lands under their control. This outcome was in its own way favorable to both sides. Chu retained most of their core, where the bulk of their population lived, and therefore could continue to fight against the other kingdoms. And Qin again doubled its size and forced the other kingdoms to continue the fight with Chu by themselves, leading to the fact that at the end of the war, the territories increased only at Wei, and not significantly. They became the next target for Qin expansion a decade later. Being the only beneficiaries after a rather bloody war, the Wei lost their allies Han and Qi, which made the future war against them quite easy. In addition, Qin gained the support of the Northern Principality of Han, not on the list of 5 hegemons, but still quite powerful. So the war and battles, due to numerical superiority, were successful for Qin. And in the end, to Qin passed the land conquered from Chu, as well as the land on the left bank of the Yellow River. In the war, on the side of Wei, also participated Zhou, who by this time owned only a few cities, and Qin had the opportunity to end this dynasty, but fearing the coalition that could be formed after such an action, captured only the western Zhou. By this time, the Qin had become the unquestioned leader in China, and ideally, a coalition should have been formed against them anyway, but Qin diplomats and agents constantly thwarted such initiatives with bribes, flattery and assassinations, so this never led to anything. Qin diplomacy had its own miscalculations, though. For example, in 288 they did not enter the war between Zhao and Yan, wanting to weaken both sides of the conflict and not expecting such an easy victory for the former. As a result, the Zhou became equal in power to the Qi and Chu, but the Qin hegemony was not greatly affected. Having significantly increased the budget of the state, the Qin ruler initiated the renovation of the capital and the construction of a large royal palace, and then decided to border with small border barbarian states that raided the territory of Qin. First, Ba, which had previously been left as a buffer zone between Chu and Qin, but now had no point in its existence, was finally conquered. Then lands as far as the Tibetan plateau and lands in the vicinity of the capital were conquered. In this way, the Qin secured their northwestern borders. Having captured such large territories in a relatively short period of 25 years, the Qin had to spend about the same amount of time, and in fact even more, to integrate them. These territories were to undergo the same reforms that Shangyans had carried out in Qin, taking land from the nobility, established bureaucracy, and so on. Therefore, Qin for a long time stopped expansion and engaged in the development of the country. Especially it was shown during the reign of the next one, who was a bad commander, but was a good manager. Under him, the newly acquired lands were fully incorporated into the kingdom, and quite a lot of money was spent on the development of sparsely populated territories to the south of Yanzi. He ruled relatively not much, about 15 years, and his son Yinzhen ascended the throne in 241 at the age of 17. Before, I didn't tell you the names of the Qin rulers so that they wouldn't merge in your head into some single Huasa, and you wouldn't remember anything. But I decided to mention this guy, because he would become the first ruler of United China, because of whom China became what it is now. A year after he ascended the throne, he started a series of wars that went down in history as Qin's Wars of Unification. The first target was again the Chu, who had suffered greatly from the ongoing wars with the Baiyue. The three Qin armies went on the offensive in three directions, the priority of which was the central, aimed at separating the north of the Chu, their core, and the south, where their armies were at the time. Having defeated the remaining Chu armies in the north, the Qin armies began to conduct a systematic occupation of their territories, which ended with the complete destruction of the Chu after 5 years. After another 5 years, Yinzhen started a new war against Zhou and Han. In fact, it was the last chance of the remaining kingdoms to unite in a coalition equal in strength with the Qin. Because the Zhou de jure remained the leaders of China, the Qin have not yet integrated the lands of Chu, and the population of the parties were equal, because its density in the north was higher. But since the other kingdoms hated each other more than they feared Qin, it did not happen. The army of Qin prevailed in two decisive battles, and in 229 conquered Zhou and Han, thus becoming so far only symbolic, but the leader of China. Further wars were no longer a challenge for the Qin army. Their armies were bigger and better equipped, and were led by skillful commanders. Next were the Wei, whom Yinzhen decided not to conquer completely, but to use them as a buffer zone for a future war with Qi and Zhao, which allowed to split their forces in two, without having an army there. By the way, you might have wondered what happened to the nobles and royal families in the conquered kingdoms. Well, judging by the fact that the other kingdoms were not in a hurry to help each other, the treatment of the conquered was not that bad. If they agreed to accept the new rules of the game and did not put up fierce resistance, such as Wei, then as the most suitable and knowledgeable candidates, they became part of the Qin bureaucracy or court. The rest were executed. I think you can guess that the majority, mostly mid-level or lower nobility, agreed, although it didn't work for everyone, but more on that later. In 221, the Qin armies started invasion to Qi and Zhao, the bloodiest of all unification wars. Because Qi were not going to surrender, they had a lot of soldiers, fortresses and cities, and therefore the major battles, sieges and looting in this war occurred the most, and the war dragged on for 4 years. When they could no longer resist, the existence of Wei ceased to make sense, and therefore Yinzhen began a new war against them, which ended with their surrender in 216. This year is considered the beginning of the Qin Empire, and Yinzhen took the probably more familiar name Qin Shi Huangdi, which can be translated as First Emperor of Qin. The change of name was of great importance, since for the first time in history of China, one state controlled such a large territory, the title of one was not suitable, and therefore it was necessary to invent a new one, Huandi. Actually, it became the title that was later used by all emperors. Shi means the first, and implies that the next emperors should be called the second, third, and so on, which kind of emphasized his desire to create an eternal, or at least long-lived empire. You can say 10,000-year Reich. So he began to set the stage for this and began to mold the conquered kingdoms into a system. The first thing was administrative reform. All territories were divided into 36 provinces, commanderies, so that people did not divide themselves by regions or former kingdoms. At the same time, Qin officials who had been part of the bureaucracy before the unification wars were promoted by one rank, making them more influential in the new administration. A further priority was the unification of the economy. Qin Shi Huang introduced a unified system of weights and measures, standardized currency, and perhaps most importantly, unified the Chinese script. In general, Chinese writing is a double-edged sword. If you have tried to learn Chinese, you know that this is very difficult. Not only there are a lot of tones that make it possible to create such sentences, but also for each shi there will be a character, learning which is more difficult than memorizing the alphabet. However, if you try to learn only the meaning of characters, you will realize that is not so difficult, at least easier than learning everything at once. Why am I saying this? In that time, China still had no unified language, and in different parts of the empire, one and the same character was read differently. But thanks to the new unified writing, its meaning did not change. This is the advantage of hieroglyphic script. It can be applied to almost any language, which in those times greatly simplified the bureaucracy. And even now, a Chinese person who knows traditional Chinese script can try to read the texts written in Qin times, and he will definitely understand the texts written in the next dynasty. If of course there is something to read, but more on that later. Massive construction of irrigation and transportation canals and dams began. Earlier, it was difficult to realize without unified efforts and full control over the whole river, because a canal or dam necessary for one state would have to be located on the territory of another state, or vice versa. Such structures would have hindered other states, and it would not be initially beneficial to build them. But what was beneficial to build then were walls and fortresses protecting these states from each other. Now there was no sense in their existence, and they became more of a divisive factor, and therefore were mostly dismantled. However, a wall can also be a unifying factor. China suffered from barbarian raids, primarily from nomads from the north and west, almost from the beginning of the time. The Chinese could not respond to their aggression in the same way that they practiced in the south, namely expansion and colonization, which continued after the creation of the empire. Because in the steppes, the optimal and with that level of technology and available crops, the only possible way of farming was nomadic cattle breeding. Therefore, the Chinese had an idea to wall them off. But since only border states benefited from the wall construction, it was impossible to build it only by their efforts, and they limited themselves only to local fortifications. Now, with a unified state, the construction of a united network of fortifications became possible, and it actually began. However, it was possible to access the real benefit of these fortifications only from the perspective of the past centuries, taking into account that the wall was completed much later, during the Ming Dynasty. And not to drag on, I will say that in history there was only one case when the wall could be useful, and it fell from treachery. So in terms of efficiency, this project was roughly equal to burning money and workers in the ground. More useful were the roads. If earlier their existence between the states was more of a threat than a benefit, now on the sprawling network of roads went the troops, officials, goods, and the emperor himself often organized trips around the country to show that he is everywhere and watching his subjects. At this point, it seems, the useful achievements of Qin Shi Huangdi end, and begin, well, let's say, not quite useful. To begin with, legalism as a state ideology has become stricter. Now, for, in fact, any misstep, the punishment was the death penalty, and officials were regularly executed as a preventive measure, so that they were afraid, so to speak. Other philosophical schools were persecuted, and their books burned. And since almost all books were written by philosophers, almost all books were burned. The famous Jisha Academy, the first documented in history state scholarly institution, located in the capital of Qi, and which used to be sponsored by their rulers, was destroyed by order of the emperor. Legalism itself was supplemented by Qin Shi Huangdi's personal obsession, namely the 5 elements. I don't see the point in revealing the essence of this thing. But for China, it meant forced unification of those things, in the unification of which there was little point without industrialization. The width of wagons, the length of hats, the width of roads, and so on. But that was still a minor detail. The far greater burden for the Chinese were their emperor's paranoia and obsession with eternal life. He survived 3 assassination attempts in his lifetime, and because of this he became distrustful of his inner circle. This in turn led to a gradual complete rotation of his inner circle through executions, as well as the creation of a network of secret palaces, roads and tunnels throughout China. He also began sending expeditions to search for mystical and legendary places where the elixir of eternal life could be found. Because if we are building an eternal empire, the ruler had better live eternally. These expeditions usually did not return, because failure was punishable by death, and they could not end in anything but failure. So Shi Huan had to limit himself to the standard option, the arrangement of his afterlife. As I said at the beginning of this story, Chinese religion was centered on interaction with the afterlife. And the more important you were in life, the cooler you would be in the afterlife. Shi Huan decided to go beyond being an emperor. And from the moment he ascended the throne, he decided to build himself a huge tomb that mimicked China itself, the large-scale construction of which began only after the unification of China. Mercury rivers and oceans, miniature copies of palaces and officials, a sky dotted with precious stones, and of course the terracotta army that was to be his army in the afterlife. More than 500,000 people built this mausoleum complex over 13 years. And it soon came in handy, because a year after it was built, Qin Shi Huangdi died, most likely because he had consumed another elixir of eternal life. Ironic. Nor did his main creation see eternal life, and immediately after his death, it began to come apart at the seams. During Shi Huan's life, the empire, as you can see, managed to mess with every stratum of the population, but the most dangerous among them were the officials, the army, and the peasants. All these construction projects, roads, walls, canals, palaces, required huge amount of resources and manpower, and in order to get them, the population was imposed huge taxes, about 2/3 of crops or produce, as well as labor duties, which very much depleted the strength of the peasantry, as well as the army, which was also engaged in construction. Officials, afraid of the death penalty for anything, looked for ways to control the ruler. And they found one. They forged Shi Huan's will and made his weak-willed son ruler. The death penalty, for any misstep, undermined the loyalty of the rest of the population to the law and the state. Because if the law says that the criminal should be executed, isn't it better for him to fight for his life by taking up arms? Thus, with the mutiny of the soldiers who were late for the military muster, began a series of uprisings that brought down the Qin dynasty. So the first totalitarian state in the history of China existed for only a couple of decades. As a result of these uprisings, more than a dozen states were formed, and there began a period of interregnum, called the 18 States, fighting among themselves for hegemony in China. It lasted, however, not long, only 4 years, after which the Mandate of Heaven took into the possession of the Han Dynasty, which firmly established itself on the throne and existed for nearly 400 years. The new dynasty needed a new ideology, as Qin Shi Huang discredited legalism, and such ideology was Confucianism, which would become the third and most important pillar of China. Confucianism appeared long ago, in the 6th century BCE, and although it already had its adherents and was one of the 6 most popular schools, it did not take its dominant role until Han times. So what are these teachings? At the heart of Confucianism are 3 main things: tradition, family, and man. And it itself is, in a sense, a collection of folk traditions and advices. Look, you don't live by laws in your family. When a parent gives their child pocket money, they don't go to a notary to legally formalize the transaction, do they? They don't. Families communicate and behave according to the way things are done, the normal way, the traditional way. There are some rules of decency. You have to respect your parents, older siblings, and the younger ones should be manipulated and exploited, but not too much. So, the state is only trying to appear to be something more than such a family. Why then pretend? The ruler is like the head of the family, a wise grandfather, who has been many places and knows a lot of things. He is the most important and respected member of the family, but he is still a member of the family, and he should treat his subjects as if they were his children and grandchildren, to be moderately strict but kind. Because of this, by the way, most images of emperors represent them as elderly people, because the older you are, the more important you are. The subjects in turn should respect their ruler, show him filial reverence, and if possible do what he asks, but at the same time think for themselves whether the attitude of the ruler to them is fair, and if there are any claims, then voice them. The state should exist for the sake of people, its children, and be governed not by laws, but by honest, righteous people, acting from the considerations of ethics, the main principle of which was, do not do to a man what you do not want yourself. It was necessary to become a righteous man by following the path of self-improvement, removing all self-interest and pettiness from oneself, becoming wiser and fairer. A woman could also become a righteous man, but according to Confucianism, it is much more difficult for her to take out of herself the desire to benefit from everything. And from this was born their inferiority. And it would be better for her not to distract righteous men from grind. Anyway, here in this rather superficial, but I hope vivid description of Confucianism, one can see what it appealed to the Han emperors. Roughly speaking, it was the opposite of legalism in all aspects, except those that were really important and really worked for the state. Labor conscription, for example, and the equality of people before the law. But the law itself and severity of punishment is better to determine the traditions, rather than for all mistakes to impose the death penalty. Let's imagine a hypothetical situation. Your father stole, let's say an ox, and the law says it's a capital offense. You say to him, "Father, stealing is bad, and you'd better not do it. But how can I turn you in? You are my dad after all." Your conversation is overheard by a Confucius follower and a legalist. The first one says, "Yes, you did everything right, boy. Better let's find out why your father stole the axe, to prevent such things in the future." And the legalist is gone. He's already run to write a denunciation on you 3, because underreporting is also punishable by death. What's my point? It is obvious that neither Confucianism nor legalism can be realized 100%. People are definitely not by a robot, but there is no majority of righteous and honest people, which means that these philosophies can be combined. After all, legalism was too favorable for the rulers to get rid of it so easily. For example, the aristocracy, much shattered after the legalist reforms, under Han again strengthened, but to the level of the feudal era will never come, and in the next dynasties again began to fade. Besides, legalism and Confucianism coincided with each other in 2 things. The first, and probably the most important thing, is the importance of competent bureaucracy. They had different ideas of what bureaucracy should be, yes, but they both had the understanding that it was necessary. And the second thing was the dislike of merchants. Look, a merchant buys cheap and sells it for more. In essence, the merchant produces nothing but profits from others. After all, who buys more expensive? Someone who is in great need of these goods. But merchants are necessary, and you can't get rid of them. This means that traders in their speculative business should be limited by price ceilings. Or it would be even better to establish state monopolies on trade in the most important goods, salt, silk, and so on. And this attitude to them remained practically under all dynasties. And the combination of Confucianism and legalism with something else depending on the dynasty became a new ideology. Confucianism became, so to speak, the face of the state, went to the people and even acquired the signs of religion with the worship of Confucius, and gave rise to such a thing as the imperial examination system, and legalism and the mandate of heaven mixed with Taoism, which I will talk about some other time, with legalism remaining in the shadow of the bureaucratic machine of the empire and its court, and the mandate of heaven being the binding link between them. And so, China was made. I hope that I was able to realize my idea, and you, having watched this video, were able to better understand the Chinese Empire, and perhaps China itself. And I also hope that it was able to stand out in your eyes from other similar videos about ancient China, because why I would have made it then? Maybe I made a mistake by integrating the game into this video, because the game took less than half of the duration, and the video itself would not have lost anything from erasing the gameplay narrative from it. Even on the contrary, it would have attracted people who are interested in history, but do not play such games. However, such a video would have been completely out of line with what I do, so I had to compromise. An experience I probably won't repeat. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like that. And with that, I bid you farewell.